Hi, I'm Roxy Keller, and I am continuing to bake my way through the Great British Baking Show challenges. And I'm on the season that was recorded in 2017. Netflix calls it season 5. And this is the last episode, the final episode of that season, which is the finals. And today I'm doing the technical challenge. So the technical challenge was to make ginger snap cookies or biscuits. They would call them biscuits because they're thin and they snap. And they need to have an intricate royal icing decoration on the top. They gave the bakers the pattern and 2.5 hours to make the cookies. And today, in my world, it is the middle of the summer. It's hot outside, flowers are blooming, bees are buzzing everywhere. So I don't want to make a ginger cookie, but I do love ginger, and I love ginger and orange together. I feel like that is a way to have ginger in the summertime because the orange brightens it up. And rather than the decorations and the types of cookies that they asked the bakers to do, I have a super cute set of cookie cutters that are shaped like bees or a honeycomb, flowers, that sort of thing. So one is even a little honey pot. So cute. So I'm going to make these cookies, and I'm going to make like a basic sugar cookie recipe and then add orange zest and ginger. While I was on vacation, I spent some time looking through YouTube at different cookie recipes and royal icing recipes and methods that different people use. And maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but I was kind of surprised that everybody does it a little bit differently. So the recipes are slightly different. The cookie recipes are slightly different. They have different ways of doing the border part of the decoration and the fill. Some people will make 2 different densities and use the thicker one for the border, use the looser one for the filling or what they call flood, and others will use the same and just use the scribe. If the flood is too thick, they'll just use a scribe to smooth it out. The 2 channels that I found most useful were, one is called Little Cookie Company and the other one is called Borderlands Bakery. Both of these have women who are cookie business owners. They sell their cookies, they make beautiful cookies, and they're both very knowledgeable and both fun to listen to. They have very nice voices and they're nice to listen to. But again, there are some differences between their recipes and their strategies. So I'm mostly going to follow the sugar cookie recipe and the royal icing recipe from Little Cookie Company today. And another day, I'll try Borderlands Bakery's methods. Little Cookie Company makes her cookies really thick, like 3/8 of an inch. And she uses a recipe for cookies that includes baking powder, which is kind of unusual because people think that will make the cookies spread in the oven, and brown sugar, which also tends to make cookies more chewy. The technique that she uses that's quite different is that rather than starting with room temperature butter and room temperature eggs, she uses cold in both cases. So I'm going to give it a try. I'm not sure really what would be the difference between using room temperature ingredients and then putting them in the refrigerator versus just starting with cold right away. She rolls them out right away, and then the cookie shapes that she's cut out, then she'll put those in the refrigerator to make sure they're nice and cold before putting them in the oven. If this works, it could be a bit of a time saver, and as I said, I'm going to use her recipe, make a couple of tweaks by adding ginger and orange, and we'll see how it goes. Wish me luck. Let's get started. In the bowl of my stand mixer, I'm putting 2 sticks of butter. She doesn't say salted or unsalted, so I'm using salted. And these are cold, just out of the refrigerator, and I have cut them into small chunks. So 2 sticks of butter is 223 grams. Typically, they're supposed to be 113 each, which is 226 grams. Close enough. Next, I'll add brown sugar. And admittedly, one thing I do not like about this recipe is that it gives the ingredient amounts in cups and not in weight. And I'm pretty sure this person is Canadian, so I'm a little concerned about what those weights are supposed to be, but she started with a recipe from another website, which you can find on her website, and then she tweaked it, and when I went back to that original one, I found, most importantly, that she uses, the original recipe used the measurement of 140 grams of flour per cup. So again, that is quite different from what you see in most American books, or anytime they tell you, oh, by the way, a cup of flour is 120 grams or 125 grams. Rarely do they say 140. So I'm going to go with 140, and I'm going to use the American weights for cups of sugar. For the brown sugar, I typically weigh that at around 220 grams. A lot of American recipes I see that have both typically show that as 200 grams, but I've never heard of someone saying use a cup of brown sugar and not implying or intending for you to pack it in. So this is 1 cup of dark brown sugar packed into the cup. Let's see how much that weighs. 209. Okay. Half a cup of granulated white sugar. So that's half a cup weighs 112 grams, which would mean a whole cup weighs 224. I'm using the paddle attachment, and she says to mix at medium speed for just like 20 seconds to get them to pull together. But then on her video, I think she mixed for probably a minute or 2 because the butter's cold. It needs to be broken up a bit. So I think I'll mix it a little bit longer than 20 seconds. On medium, it does do a pretty good job of cutting with the butter. So 2 eggs right out of the refrigerator. 2 eggs mixed at low speed just until blended, and add the eggs one at a time. Next, her recipe calls for a tablespoon of vanilla extract and a tablespoon of butter emulsion. And I have butter emulsion, but I want these to have an orange flavor, so I'm adding orange emulsion. 1 tablespoon of each. Before I add the dry ingredients, I want to add my ginger and orange. I'm going to add half a teaspoon of ground ginger. Now I have this candied cubed ginger in a syrup that's used for cocktails. I'm going to strain some of that So I'm adding 1 tablespoon of the candied cubed ginger in syrup, but I drained out the syrup, and the zest of 2 oranges. Now, these are medium to medium small oranges, and I washed them with baking soda and vinegar, and hopefully, I hope that that removes any pesticides, germs, waxes I've heard they put on oranges. So, zest. Okay, ginger, orange added. For once, I haven't forgotten my extra ingredients. Just going to mix this for a few seconds. Now, this recipe does not call for you to mix all of the dry ingredients together and then whisk them. Rather, you add each of the small ingredients like salt, baking powder, cornstarch is another interesting ingredient that she adds, and then add the flour separately. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's no weights given for the flour, and it calls for 4.5 cups. So I multiplied that by 140 grams, and that means I need to put in 630 grams of all-purpose flour. While mixing on low, I'll add 1 teaspoon of salt, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, and 1 tablespoon of cornstarch. Okay, finally, the 630 grams of all-purpose flour. Scrape the sides and bottom after adding each third. I forgot to mention that the recipe that she got hers from actually lists a range of flour depending on your home, the humidity in your home, things like that. So yeah, I don't know. She didn't mention a range. She just said 4.5 cups. So I'm just going to go with 4.5 cups for now. Add 140 grams per cup. Okay, well, that's definitely a pretty thick dough. Seems to have a pretty good texture. So this definitely looks like a dough that can be rolled. So that's the next step. It's time to roll out the dough, and she doesn't use any flour on the bench top. She just rolls it between parchment paper. So that's what I'm going to try. The less you add flour to your cookies, the less chance you have of them being super hard. Now, that baking powder is supposed to help make them crumbly, so let's hope. And she says to roll out half the dough, cut the cookies out, preserve the extras separately, then roll out the second one, cut those cookies out, preserve the pieces in between, and then all of those you roll together. I'm using this large baking sheet, and another unique thing that she doesn't do is that she does not put parchment paper, just puts the cookies directly on the cookie sheet. So that's what I'm going to do. I've got to try these things to know if they work for me. with the dough between 2 sheets of parchment paper, and I have my rolling pin set on 3/8 of an inch. I will roll it out. Wow, those are thick. I mean, this piece of dough is only about that big, so I would get maybe 4 cookies out of it. I think I'm going to go down to a 1/4 inch just because my cookie cutters are really big. I'm having a problem with my rolling pin just sliding on the parchment paper. Now, she has a nifty new rolling pin that's wood and still has spacers, and it looked pretty cool. And I'm kind of tired of dealing with this particular one of these. This has worked very well, but you screw this piece in, and something's wrong with the threads on what I screw it into, so it won't screw in all the way, so you can kind of see that these are loose. I'm tired of that anyway. So I ordered one that she had on her website, and maybe it won't have this problem, but I'll manage, but it's just annoying. Hey, just a different way to roll out cookies, right? Well, that does work quite nicely. No flour. Okay, hopefully they'll come off of the sheet just as easily. I have this one cookie cutter that's a honeycomb with a little bee in it, and it's just so cute. I gotta try it. I'm not super sure. Is the idea that I take the bee out, or is that just there to help me get the shape of a bee? I'm not sure. She says just wiggle your cookie cutter a little bit and it should come right out. So far, so good. Then the other 6 cookie cutters I have are actually what they call impression cookie cutters. And look how cute they are. There's bumblebee, a honey pot, flower, honeycomb, a beehive, and a bee. By impression, it means that there is an exterior cookie cutter, and then this little plunger on top. When you push that, it makes an impression on the cookie to make it easier for you to decorate, because it gives you lines and stuff. I just did 2 of the honey pot, and this one is beehive. I'm trying to have as little unused dough as possible. Because the less we re-roll it, the less chance of it being tough. So push down on the outside to cut the cookie, and then push the plunger for the impression. Wiggle, and with smaller lines and things, sometimes, and it happened with this honey pot too, I should have known better, need to get a little bit of flour. First I have to dig out this dough that got stuck in there. And any of the extra dough, like I said, she says put it in a separate bowl. Then after you do your second roll, you can combine all of that together to roll out. Okay, so to flour this impression, I'm pushing down the plunger and then getting a little bit of flour. Don't want it too packed on here, so knock the flour off, but there's a little bit of flour on those lines. Push down for the exterior, light push for the impression. And hopefully this one comes out. Yeah, that flour really helps. Okay, do my second beehive here. Good, left a little bit of flour, not a big deal. Now for the little flower, this is basically like flower from the side, I'm guessing, so that you can sort of show a bee, you know, going at the nectar. A couple of this is just a honeycomb. The other nice thing about having this little plunger is, I don't know if you just noticed, I was pulling up the cutter and the dough was starting to come with it, so I just pushed the plunger and it kind of pushed it back down. Okay, now when she does the 3/8 inch thick, she just lifts up the paper to get the cookies. I've always used a spatula, but with small areas, if you try to get a spatula underneath, if your spatula has any kind of thickness, it can just sort of smush the whole thing rather than getting the cookie under it. So I like this idea of just lifting it up and grabbing the dough and setting it on the cookie sheet. Snap a quick picture of this to show you, and here it is. Okay, now I'm going to lift these up, hopefully. I'm going to keep the little bee in the honeycomb there. Okay, that's what I have so far. I have a little bit more space for a few more. So I'm going to get the other half of the dough. Second half of the dough, and let's hope it rolls out as nicely. Okay, now I just have my two bees. I'm going to do extras of these because they're so cute. My oven is ready, so I'm going to go ahead and put a few of these cookies on this cookie sheet. And she says to put your baking sheet in the refrigerator for 10 minutes, and then you can put them in the oven. I have the oven preheated to 350 degrees, and she says they'll take 10 to 14 minutes. Mine will probably take a little bit less time because they're a 1/4 inch thick instead of 3/8, and they're supposed to just start to brown on the edges. Some people don't want it to get that to that stage, but that's what she likes, and frankly, that's what I like too. So let's do that. I'm a little worried about the antennae of the bee. Here's a picture. Hopefully they'll come off the page pretty easily. I'm going to try this one first. Phew. Worked okay. Oops, but it bent this one. Okay, into the fridge. It actually says 10 to 15 minutes, so I'm going to go with 15 because it's pretty warm and humid in here. So 15 minutes in the fridge. Here's my second sheet. Okay, the first batch is out, and it took 10.5, 11 minutes. I was afraid to leave it in much longer. I didn't want it to get overdone. And I did see a little bit of browning around the bottom edges. So the second sheet is in, and I set the timer to 10 minutes and 30 seconds, so I'll check it then. While all of that was happening, I put this in the refrigerator just to keep it nice and cold. So I don't know if I need to sort of press this together or what. She says the reason she says to do it that way is to keep the bubbles out of the dough. I don't know. I never really had bubbles in my cookie dough that I know of. I know it's such a weird way of rolling out cookie dough, but I don't think it's any different to the dough, because even if you were just rolling, the dough would have to slide against the parchment paper as it spreads. So I guess it's not completely crazy. Now I'll cut out a variety of other shapes. I'm not sure if I'm going to do many of just this honeycomb because I don't really know what's the best way to decorate it. Okay, yeah, so I think 11 minutes is just right because that batch that's cooling I put in for 10.5, and then I just thought I need a little bit more, so 11. All right, now the first batch is cool, and I want to see if they're, oh yeah, they slide right up. And the bottom looks good, nice and golden brown. I don't want them to be, dough colored. I want them to have a little bit of brown, so perfect. She doesn't say anything about the rest, but I'm going to roll it one more time. I have this little, I don't know if it's supposed to be a sun or like a sunflower, but it's cute, so I'm going to use it. Okay, these are going in the fridge for 15 minutes. Then in the oven for 11 minutes, and then I'll be finished making them. I'm excited about this cookie recipe. I really like it. The cookies don't spread. They bake well. The dough tastes good. I haven't actually tasted a cookie yet, but I bet they taste good. My next step is to make royal icing, and she has a couple of really interesting and different ingredients in her royal icing as well. One of those is corn syrup, and when you look at her frosting on her videos, it looks so smooth. So I'm really hoping that the corn syrup will help with that. And she said it also is to make it shiny. Then another one is she adds a full tablespoon of white gel food coloring, a bright white. And it's supposed to not only help make your colors better because your vanilla extract is brown, it gives a brownish tint, but also it's supposed to help keep your colors from bleeding into each other, into the cookies, into the outlines, whatever. So I had to order some because I'm all out of white. I didn't have nearly that much, so I've ordered a nice big bottle of it. And she also adds some of that butter emulsion that she also puts in her cookies. Again, I'm going to use orange emulsion. Then the rest of the ingredients are pretty typical: powdered sugar, water, and meringue powder. So my bright white gel coloring is on order from Amazon. It's supposed to arrive today. So I'm going to store these cookies and do the decorating tomorrow. So see you then. Stay tuned. Okay, so as you see from the photo, I got a lot of different cookies, and in total there are 44 cookies, and they're pretty good size, so that's a pretty good recipe for a decent number of cookies. Now I'm going to make the royal icing, and as I mentioned before, she includes a couple of unique ingredients. She talks about not blending with a whisk attachment. You want to blend your frosting with a paddle attachment, blend it slowly, blend it only as much as you need to, keeping the air bubbles out. And finally, she makes a batch that has 2 kilograms of powdered sugar. Again, she's from Canada, so I guess that's what size her bags come in. These are most of what we get in the United States is a 2-pound bag. So I'm just going to add powdered sugar to bring it up to the amount that she has. She also uses the butter emulsion in her frosting. And again, since I'm making an orange flavored cookie, I'm going to use orange emulsion in place of it. So she doesn't talk about sifting the powdered sugar, but I'm going to do that just to make sure there's no big clumps. With just a little bit of spillage, that comes to 905 in that bag. So I need to bring it up with a little bit of extra. Now I need to add 3 tablespoons of meringue powder. She says to put that on your stand mixer and just blend those together, but if you've been watching, you know that my low speed is not that low, and I'll lose a bunch of this, so I'm just going to whisk it with a hand whisk. I don't think I'm going to incorporate a bunch of air just by doing that. Now 2/3 cup of water, and this doesn't really have to be precise because you're going to add as much as you need to get it to the consistency you want. And she says to start with about half of that. Again, I'm going to get it started with a spoon. I'm just trying to pull it together somewhat at this point. And we do have other liquids to add. Okay, so at this point I have a very thick, still not all wet paste. But I'm going to add the 1/4 cup of corn syrup, 1 tablespoon of vanilla extract, 1 tablespoon of orange emulsion, and the other unique thing that I talked about earlier and Amazon delivered last night is the bright white food coloring gel. So I'm sure this has a little protective lid, and I'm adding a tablespoon of that. That's why I bought a big jar bottle. Okay, I think I can put it on the stand mixer now. Okay, on the lowest speed, I'm going to just mix this until everything's blended. Scrape the bowl. There's a bunch of the paste down at the bottom, but it's really looking like hers, so I'm excited. Okay, so that's it. And at this point, I want to look at the icing and decide if I want to change the consistency. So like her, I like to start with my outline consistency, which is the thicker one. And she talks about how you look for the ribbon stage, and when you use your spoon or your spatula to raise some of the frosting up, it takes a certain number of seconds for the ribbons to sink back into the icing. And for a thick consistency, you want something high, a number like 20, 25 seconds. And if you want a really thin consistency, like for your flooding, some people say as high as 15. She seems to like around 8 or 10, which is really loose. I will show you this with my phone camera, how that looks. But right now, I have to go work out. I have a class in about an hour, and it takes me about that long to get there. So I will continue this when I get back. Now, to keep this royal icing fresh, all I need to do, and I've always put a piece of plastic wrap down on the frosting, but she just says to use a wet paper towel, wet towel over the top, and apparently that's enough to keep it moist. So, do I want to do that? Well, as you see, I went with plastic wrap, and I didn't push it all the way down on the frosting, but I made sure it's sealed so that it's airtight. It's time now to color the royal icing, and I have my white base icing, and I did just now put this wet paper towel because I wanted to make sure it was moist while I set up everything. And so what we need for coloring and doing our icing is our icing, of course. And I have several different gel colors. I have been using AmeriColor because that's what they sell primarily at Mangelson's, which is a local craft store. It's an amazing store in Omaha, Nebraska. And so I use AmeriColor. There are people who use other brands, And the brand that I used for the white is called Ann Clark. I know some of the YouTube videos show people using Chef Master. I'm not sure that it really matters, just that you use a gel food coloring. Then I have some small bowls that I'm going to blend the different colors in. I have lots of spoons. I have my scissors because we are going to use these tipless bags. And tipless meaning that we won't put a coupler in here. We won't use special tips. All we have to do is cut a little bit of the bag end off, and we will be able to do everything we need to do. These are very thin bags with very soft seams, I guess is the way to put it, because I'll show you in a minute when we load this up. It's important that the bag is kind of soft and that the seams are not too thick or rigid or heavy, because when we make our hole, we want it to be pretty much a round hole. If the seams are too heavy or thick, then you'll get sort of an oval, and you don't want that. There are cookie decorators who sell tipless bags as well, so just try some and use the ones that work best for you. Then some decorators will put icing in the bag and tie a knot in the bag. I don't like to do that because sometimes I might need to add more icing, and I don't want to have to ruin a bag and start a new bag. So I use these little clips that tie off the bag at the top. I think that's pretty much it. I have water to thin out maybe the base icing, but definitely the individual colors after I've added the color, because the color will add a slight bit of liquid depending on how much food coloring you put in it. But I have this dropper so that I can add water in very small amounts at a time so that we don't get it too loose. Now you can add more powdered sugar, but it's just more work. So starting with our base royal icing, it sat here for a couple of hours, and you can see that there are some bubbles that bubbled up. And that's the same sort of thing that's going to happen when we color our icings, because when we stir, it's going to incorporate air, and we want to let those settle out. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with the black. And so I'm going to take one of my small bowls, stir up this icing a little bit. And so this is our base icing. Again, you can see how thick it is, and there were actually some unmixed bits down at the bottom, so I might have a little bit of lumps right there. So I'm just stirring it to make sure that I don't have any lumps. Now, as to the consistency, if we take a spoonful and let it fall, 1, 2, 3, 4, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. So this is super thick. I think it'll work well as a border. So I'm not going to thin this out at all. I think that's going to be a good border thickness. So let's start with the black. And one of my challenges when I do cookie decorating like this is trying to figure out how much I need of each color, because I want to try to color everything that I need right from the beginning, because if I don't and I have to make it again, I may not be able to get exactly the same color. So it's better to overestimate than underestimate, and that tends to always happen anyway, because when you look at all the cookies you have to do and all the flooding, you think, oh my gosh, this is so much frosting. But then when you start actually using it, it turns out you don't use nearly as much as you think you will. If you have made royal icing before or have seen people make it, you will hopefully see how gorgeous this icing is. It is just so smooth and pretty. Okay, so again, this has to be enough for both the borders and the flood. As I set this to the side, I am going to put the wet paper towel over it. I had no idea it was so difficult to tape parchment paper down. The tape does not want to stick to the parchment paper. I mean, I guess that's why parchment paper is great, because nothing wants to stick to it, but I thought tape would stick to it. Oh, okay. Now, when you add coloring, you want to start, unless you know your colors well, you want to start with a small amount. You can always add more. If you overcolor it, then you have to go back, get more icing. I have a funny story about gray icing. I was making a cake for someone, and I wanted black. And it seemed like, this was decades ago, this was a long time ago, it seemed like no matter how much black color I added, it just was always gray. And so I remember telling people, oh my gosh, I cannot make black icing. It's always a bit gray. And we laughed about it. We thought it was funny. And then one time they were watching Steel Magnolias, and there was a scene where someone had made, I think, an armadillo cake, and they made it gray. And everybody was making a joke. How in the world do you make gray icing? I thought, I know. But one thing to remember, and yes, I'm still going to add a bit more to this to make it more black. This is called super black, but it's still, you need a lot of it. Colors do get darker as they dry. So even if this looks like sort of a dark gray, I'm confident that it will look black once it's piped out and on the bees. Okay, so she made a point about the frosting that's on the edges and how that could be dry at this point, or it may dry over time. And you can already see some bubbles popping up. We want to let this sit for 15 minutes or so and make sure all the bubbles have released. And while I do that, I'm going to put a wet paper towel over it, and that will even keep these edges wet so that I can reincorporate them when I'm ready to put this into my bag. So I'll cover this and set it aside while I do the other colors, and by that time it'll probably be time to put this in a bag. Okay, now the yellow. So I've got gold, because I do want kind of a gold yellow. I'm going to add a little bit also of this electric yellow. Because I want it to be a little bit brighter. I think that's a nice yellow. Yeah, that's pretty. Wet paper towel, set it aside. Now for the brown. So I have chocolate brown and warm brown. Let's see how the chocolate looks. Ooh, that came out fast. I'm going to add just a little bit of the warm brown. It's very red. Weird. I have a different bottle of the chocolate brown, and it's more gel-like, so maybe that other one was not mixed properly in the bottle. Well, I'm going to need more. Well, basically brown is the mixture of all the colors, I think, pretty much. So I'm going to add a little green to see if I can get this more brown and less red. It's definitely looking a little more chocolatey. It doesn't have to be perfect brown because really the brown is just for like part of the beehive, the honey pot, the center of my flower, and so nothing says it has to be a perfectly dark chocolate brown. I'll try to just get it a little bit darker. Considering that it will darken up a little bit as it dries, I think that's a good color. All right, cover and set aside. The only other color I know I'll need is the white. So I'm going to go ahead and bag some of my white. So I have my holder. I just open my bag. This is a 12-inch bag, and the ones that I've used previously on this channel is 14 or 16-inch, so this one doesn't fit around quite as well, but it does fit, so it'll still work. Okay, so just thinking about the white I need for the border. So I want to try to get air out of it. Any air that's down here will come out when I cut the hole in the bag. But this one had been sitting, so I think the air had settled out. Now, they say you don't want to have too much in the bag because you want to be able to be very precise. And if I were doing really fine lines or fine text, I would probably use even less than that. And again, because I might need to add more, just use my little clip to close it off. And I use a black Sharpie to make an O so that I'll remember that this is the outline consistency. I have enough left of white for the flood, but I also might want to make another color later on, like a blue or a green or a red for some accents. So I don't want to thin out all of this white for the flood. But that's probably plenty right there. Again, not much left, but I am going to put this in a bowl so that it'll be in a smaller bowl and it will stay moist until we need it. Okay, I'm going to thin this out a little bit to make it a flood consistency. And it doesn't take much water to do that. But it is getting thinner. It was about 14 seconds. I'm going to add just a little bit more. Again. Add a little bit more water. I want to get it down to about a 10-second flood. All right, I'm there. So now I want to let this one sit, let the air bubbles out. You can already see the bubbles making their way out. They'll make their way out more quickly from the flooding consistency. Back to the black, and it's been a lot more than 15 minutes because I paused and had lunch. So the colored, especially the black, shouldn't take as long or as much water to get it to the right consistency because of the gel liquid has already thinned it a bit. All right, I think that was good. Yellow. We just want to pop these bubbles. You really have to be patient. Do it several times. So when she does it, she pulls the bag off and then presses the spoon off with her fingers from the outside. That way she doesn't get frosting on her fingers. That works. Okay, now I have my 4 outline consistencies. So that's before adding any water. So I'm putting an F on it for flood. I don't know if you could hear it, but I could actually hear the bubbles popping. Just little tiny. I have so much of the yellow flood that I think I'm going to put it in 2 bags. Bees and flowers and honey and honeycombs and hives, they're all yellow or yellowish. And yellow is my favorite color, so that's why there's more. These colors do have the potential, the ability to stain your hands. Not necessarily clothing unless you put the gel color right on your clothing. It could stain, but dishes, a sink, it washes out. Countertops, typically it washes out, I guess, depending on what your countertop's made of, but yeah, it typically washes out. Okay, we have all our colors.